Right now, the Colorado River is facing a cut plan that could save more than 3.2 million acre-feet of water, while the states that depend on it remain deadlocked. That is not an abstract accounting figure. It is water tied to Lake Mead, Lake Powell, desert cities, farms, power lines, tribal claims, and canals that cross some of the driest ground in North America. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that the system is under severe pressure, with low inflows and critical reservoir elevations no longer behaving like distant scenarios. A river, once managed as a dependable foundation, is being negotiated like an emergency room bed. But that is not the scariest part. The scariest part is that even a number this large may not solve the deeper problem, because the crisis is not only about how much water can be left behind, it is about who gives it up first, who can survive the loss, and whether rules written for an older river can still hold a hotter one. So the question is no longer whether the Colorado River is in trouble. It is what this deadlock reveals about the future of water systems built for a climate baseline that is already moving. Those watching from the west, or from any place where water decides daily life, can like, subscribe, and comment with where they live. The scene does not begin with a dry riverbed. That would be too simple. It begins with water still moving through concrete, still turning through turbines, still sliding through canals toward cities that look permanent from the air. It begins at Lake Powell, where pale rock walls show the old waterline like a scar. It continues downstream at Lake Mead, where boat ramps have been extended, closed, moved, and extended again, as if the shoreline itself keeps retreating from the map. It runs through Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, the Central Arizona Project, the Colorado River Aqueduct, the All-American Canal, and thousands of smaller gates that decide whether water reaches an alfalfa field, a lettuce crop, a subdivision, or a tribal community still waiting for promised access. The people affected are not one group. That is what makes the crisis harder to see. It touches the farmer in Imperial Valley deciding whether land can be fallowed without breaking a business. It touches the family in Phoenix, whose water bill carries the hidden cost of a river hundreds of miles away. It touches Las Vegas, which has become one of the most aggressive urban water conservation stories in the West, yet still depends on Lake Mead for most of its supply. It touches Tucson, which has stored Colorado River water underground for years as insurance against exactly this kind of future. It touches Southern California, where cities and farms are connected to a river that is no longer only a river, but a legal structure, a power system, a food system, and a political border. And it touches people who are often mentioned last, even though their rights are among the oldest and most legally significant in the basin: tribal nations. Some tribes have senior water rights on paper, but not the pipes, canals, treatment plants, or funding needed to use all of that water in practice. In a normal year, that gap is an injustice. In a shortage year, it becomes a structural wound. The river can be overpromised, while some of the people with the strongest claims still do not have full access to what the law says is theirs. What is happening now is not just that the river is low. The emergency is that the river is being managed in the narrow space between hydrology and negotiation. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, have advanced a plan that says they can save more than 3.2 million acre-feet through 2028. Federal officials are reviewing the proposal. Arizona officials have said talks with the Bureau of Reclamation have been constructive, but the 7 basin states are still not aligned on the larger question: how to operate the river after the current rules expire. That expiration matters because the old rules were designed to manage shortages that once looked exceptional. Now the shortage itself is becoming part of the operating environment. The post-2026 guidelines are not a footnote. They are the instruction manual for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, and for the releases that shape almost everything downstream. If those rules fail to match the river that actually exists, then every following decision becomes a patch over a crack. The severity can be read in reservoir elevations, but it can also be read in behavior. States that once fought over increases are now fighting over reductions. Cities that once celebrated growth are now measuring lawns, leaks, reuse systems, and groundwater banks. Irrigation districts are negotiating fallowing programs. Federal agencies are weighing emergency operations. Lawyers are watching every word because one clause can move water, money, and political power across the map. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool without major intervention. Minimum power pool is not the bottom of the reservoir. That distinction matters. It is the elevation below which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably produce hydropower. In other words, the danger is not only that a lake becomes visibly smaller, the danger is that one function after another begins to fail before the lake is empty. First, the reservoir loses margin. Then the power system loses flexibility. Then downstream releases become harder to manage. Then the water supply debate stops being about comfort and starts being about system control. The official warnings are written in technical language, but their meaning is blunt. Lake Powell has faced extremely low inflow forecasts. The federal government has considered reduced releases from Powell to protect critical elevations. Lake Mead remains under shortage rules. The Lower Basin Plan is being evaluated because waiting for a perfect 7-state agreement could allow the physical system to move faster than the political system. That is the nightmare inside the paperwork. Water does not wait for consensus. On one side of the argument, the lower basin states say, measurable conservation is already on the table. They point to a package that could keep millions of acre-feet in the system, including savings from users who have already taken reductions and new measures meant to stabilize the reservoirs through the next few years. Their message is simple. The lower river is ready to act, and federal approval can prevent more chaotic cuts. On the other side, the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, worry that the lower river has been using too much for too long and that reservoir operations could shift the burden upstream. They do not all use their full legal allocations, and they see mandatory cuts as a threat to future development, agriculture, and communities that argue they did not create the largest share of the current imbalance. Their message is also simple. A temporary lower basin plan cannot become a backdoor that forces the upper basin to carry risks it did not agree to carry. Between those positions sits the federal government, holding a river system that cannot be governed like a normal infrastructure project. A road can be closed, a bridge can be repaired, a power line can be replaced in sections, but the Colorado River is a moving chain of obligations. Water released from Lake Powell affects Lake Mead. Water conserved in Arizona may help reservoir elevations, but may also raise questions about who paid, who benefited, and whether the conservation is temporary or permanent. Water left in a field by fallowing land may protect a reservoir, but it may also remove wages from a rural economy. Every acre-foot has a shadow. This is why the viewer should care even far from the southwest. The Colorado River crisis is a preview of a larger kind of climate stress. It shows what happens when a society builds confidence into infrastructure, then the climate quietly changes the assumptions beneath it. The dams still stand. The canals still work. The contracts still exist. The maps still show the same river, but the timing, volume, and reliability of the water have shifted enough that the system begins to ask questions. It was not built to answer. Who absorbs the first cut? Who is protected by senior rights? Who has money to conserve? Who has land that can be temporarily dried? Who has groundwater as a backup? Who has no backup at all? These are not side issues. They are the real anatomy of drought. For a city, shortage can appear as a policy announcement. For a farmer, it can appear as a planting decision made months before harvest. For a tribal community, it can appear as another delay in infrastructure that should have existed decades ago. For a dam operator, it can appear as an elevation number approaching a threshold. For a power manager, it can appear as lost hydropower during a hot summer. For a family, it can appear as higher costs, fewer choices, and a quiet realization that water security was never as automatic as it felt. The Colorado River is not disappearing in a single dramatic moment. That is part of the danger. It is being compressed. Compressed by heat, by dry soil, by low snowpack, by overuse, by legal promises, by population growth, by crops, by power demand, by history. And now, it is being compressed by time. The states are not negotiating over an abundant river and deciding how to share the surplus. They are negotiating over a shrinking margin and trying to decide who will admit it first. This is the real present tense of the crisis. A plan large enough to sound historic is being placed against a system stressed enough to make even historic action feel temporary. Reservoirs are not just low, they are closer to operational thresholds. Conservation is not just voluntary, it is becoming a condition for stability. Negotiations are not just delayed, they are racing a physical decline that cannot be postponed by law. That is why the scene matters. Not because every tap is about to run dry, not because every farm will vanish, not because the West is doomed. Those claims would be too easy and too careless. The reason it matters is more unsettling. The Colorado River is showing how a modern system can remain visible, functional, and legally intact, while the assumptions inside it begin to fail. The water is still moving. The question is whether the agreement can move before the river drops again. The number at the center of this fight is 3.2 million acre-feet. It sounds technical enough to disappear. Acre-feet is the language of water managers, irrigation districts, reservoir operators, and legal agreements. It is not the language most people use when they turn on a faucet or buy lettuce at a grocery store, but that is exactly why the number matters. Some of the most important crises in the modern world arrive disguised as units the public does not feel. An acre-foot is simple when stripped of the jargon. It is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. 1 acre-foot is about 325,851 gallons. So 3.2 million acre-feet is not just a large accounting entry. It is more than 1 trillion gallons of water. More precisely, it is a volume so large that the mind has to stop treating it like water and start treating it like geography. Picture a field. Then picture that field buried under a sheet of water 1 foot deep. Now repeat that image not once, not 1,000 times, but 3.2 million times. That is the shape of the promise being placed on the table. It is a man-made lake in political form, a missing ocean spread across paper, a volume of water big enough to sound like rescue, and yet small enough, in this crisis, to still leave the basin arguing. That is the first shock. The number is enormous. The second shock is that enormous may not be enough. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, have said their plan can deliver at least 3.2 million acre-feet of savings through 2028. That includes major reductions already proposed by the lower basin and additional conservation layered on top. In ordinary political language, this would be presented as a breakthrough. 3 states that often compete for the same shrinking river are saying they can leave a historic volume of water in the system. They are offering a number that can be measured, tracked, and placed against the elevation of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. But the Colorado River does not respond to political adjectives. It responds to inflow, evaporation, releases, withdrawals, soil moisture, snowpack, and temperature. 1 trillion gallons can be heroic in a press release and still insufficient against a structural deficit. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the headline. The plan is large because the problem is larger. To understand why, the viewer has to see the river as a balance sheet with moving walls. On one side is supply, snow that falls in the Rocky Mountains, runoff that survives dry soils, water that reaches tributaries, water that passes through reservoirs, water that can be released without pushing dams into dangerous operating zones. On the other side is demand, cities, farms, tribes, industry, hydropower, ecosystems, and Mexico. For decades, the basin has tried to manage the difference with storage. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were built to make a variable river feel more reliable than it really was. Reservoirs do that by borrowing from wet years. They take a surplus and store it for a dry future. But when dry years stack up, and when warmer air pulls more moisture from land and water, the reservoir stops being a savings account and starts looking like a credit card. Each year of shortage carries forward. Each emergency release or emergency conservation deal buys time, but not necessarily balance. That is why 3.2 million acre-feet is both massive and fragile. It can raise or protect reservoir elevations. It can reduce immediate pressure. It can slow the system's movement toward critical thresholds. It can prevent a worse federal response in the short term. But it cannot by itself rewrite the hydrology of the basin. It cannot guarantee a deep snowpack. It cannot cool the air. It cannot make dry soils stop drinking the first pulse of runoff before that water reaches the river. It cannot erase a century of legal promises made around a river that was assumed to be more generous than it often is. The Colorado River supplies water for tens of millions of people and supports millions of acres of irrigated agriculture. Those two facts are often placed beside each other as if they are just statistics. But together, they explain the political deadlock. Cities see the river as drinking water, public health, growth, and survival. Farms see it as soil, labor, contracts, crops, equipment, debt, and family history. Tribes see it through the lens of sovereignty, legal rights, and promises long delayed. States see it as power, development, and future leverage. The federal government sees a system that cannot be allowed to crash. So when someone says 3.2 million acre-feet, they are not only naming water, they are naming sacrifices. Some of that water may come from leaving fields unplanted. That sounds clean until it reaches a worker who depends on the harvest. Some may come from urban conservation. That sounds easy until it reaches households that have already removed lawns, cities that have already invested in reuse, and communities that wonder why growth continues while residents are told to use less. Some may come from infrastructure improvements. That sounds efficient until it runs into money, time, legal permission, and the fact that not every canal or farm can be modernized at the same speed. Some may come from compensated conservation, where users are paid not to use water. That sounds practical until the question becomes who gets paid, who is left out, and whether temporary payments can solve a permanent imbalance. The headline number also hides an important distinction. Saving water is not the same as creating water. Conservation can keep more water in reservoirs, but it does not add new snow to the mountains. It does not create a second Colorado River. It rearranges demand to prevent collapse. That rearrangement can be necessary, even life-saving for the system. But it is not magic. This is where the story turns from impressive to unsettling. In a stable system, 3.2 million acre-feet would look like a cushion. In a strained system, it looks like a brace placed under a cracking beam. The brace may hold. It may prevent a dangerous drop. It may buy enough time for a broader agreement. But the beam is still carrying too much weight. The weight is measured in old expectations. It is measured in farmland, planted around reliable diversions. It is measured in suburbs built around imported water. It is measured in dams designed to smooth natural variability, not to permanently compensate for a hotter climate. It is measured in legal entitlements that can exceed what the river delivers in dry years. It is measured in the difference between paper water and wet water. Paper water is what a contract, compact, decree, or allocation says someone can use. Wet water is what actually comes down the river. For a long time, reservoirs helped blur the difference. They made paper water feel real, even when the sky was stingy. But when storage falls, the difference becomes visible. It appears as a white bathtub ring on canyon walls. It appears as lower hydropower output. It appears as emergency consultation. It appears as a federal warning. It appears as states accusing one another of asking too much and giving too little. That is why the number has emotional force. It does not shock because it is big. It shocks because even a number this big has to fight for relevance against the scale of the basin's structural imbalance. The average viewer does not need to memorize acre-feet to understand the crisis. They need to understand what the unit reveals. An acre-foot turns water into land. It links volume to surface, river to field, reservoir to harvest. It shows why water is not only something that flows, it is something that occupies space, supports food, carries electricity, and holds together settlements that were built on confidence. 3.2 million acre-feet is a headline because it is the size of the attempted rescue. It is also a warning because it shows how much water has to be withheld just to keep the system away from worse outcomes for a few more years. In another era, that might have sounded like a temporary drought response. In this era, it sounds like an introduction to the new math of the American West. The river is no longer asking whether the states can find a symbolic compromise. It is asking whether they can remove real water demand from a real system before real elevations fall too far. That is a harder question than any headline can hold, because the most important part of 3.2 million acre-feet is not the size of the number. It is the fact that the Colorado River now needs numbers this large just to buy time. The overlooked part is not that the Colorado River is running short of water. That is true, but it is not deep enough. The overlooked part is that the river system is falling out of sync. The law is on one calendar, the snowpack is on another, the reservoirs are on another, farms are on another, cities are on another, power demand is on another, and the climate is now pushing all of those clocks at once. This is why the deadlock is so dangerous. It is not simply a fight between states that want more and states that want to give less. It is a fight inside a machine whose gears no longer line up. The Colorado River was divided by agreements that assumed a certain kind of river. The river would rise and fall. Some years would be wet, some years would be dry. But reservoirs would smooth out the difference, and law would decide who received water, when, and how much. The whole system depended on a hidden promise: that the past was a useful guide to the future. That promise is now the weak point. A farmer does not plant according to a press conference. A farmer plants according to a season. Seed, labor, fertilizer, equipment, market contracts, and irrigation schedules all arrive before the public sees the shortage in a headline. If water is uncertain, the damage begins before a canal runs dry. It begins at the decision point. It begins in the window when land is either planted or left bare. That window is one of the small parts that can break a much larger system. A city also runs on timing. Water planners do not only need an annual total, they need reliability through heat waves, population swings, firefighting demand, storage rules, and treatment capacity. A reservoir that looks large from a satellite image may still be dangerously low for the month when electricity demand peaks and water demand rises together. The problem is not only the amount of water behind the dam, it is whether that water is in the right place, at the right elevation, at the right time. This is where the phrase, "not enough water," becomes misleading. A river system can fail from mismatched timing before it fails from absolute emptiness. Lake Powell is the clearest example. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that Powell could fall below minimum power pool without major intervention. Minimum power pool is not a poetic phrase, it is an engineering threshold. Below that elevation, Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably generate hydropower. The lake would still contain water. The dam would still stand. The canyon would still hold a reservoir. But one major function of the system would be impaired. That is the hidden mechanism. Infrastructure does not wait until zero to fail. It has thresholds. A reservoir is not a bucket. A bucket works until it is empty. A reservoir connected to dams, turbines, release rules, canals, water rights, and downstream obligations works only within a range. Above certain elevations it has flexibility. Near certain thresholds, every foot matters. Below certain thresholds, the system begins losing functions one by one. This is why the visible image of drought can deceive the public. The bathtub ring at Lake Mead or Lake Powell is dramatic, but the more important crisis is not the exposed rock. It is the shrinking control room behind it. Less elevation means fewer choices. Fewer choices mean more pressure on releases. More pressure on releases means more conflict between the upper basin and lower basin. More conflict means slower decisions. Slower decisions mean the reservoirs absorb the delay, and reservoirs do not negotiate. The Colorado River snowpack is also a timing problem. Snow is not just water stored in the mountains. It is a delayed release system. In the older rhythm, winter storms laid down snow at high elevations, spring warmth melted it, and runoff moved toward the river when downstream users expected it. But a warmer basin changes that sequence. More precipitation can fall as rain instead of snow. Snow can melt earlier. Dry soils can absorb more runoff before it reaches streams. Hotter air can pull more moisture into the atmosphere. The same mountain range can produce a different river. That means the basin can look promising during winter and still disappoint in spring. It can receive storms and still send less water into reservoirs. The public may see snow on peaks. Hydrologists may see dry soil beneath it, early melt, and a runoff forecast that refuses to match the visual picture. This is not just drought. This is a timing fracture. The old water law asks questions in annual volumes. How much is allocated? How much is delivered? How much is conserved? But the new hydrology asks questions in sequence. When did snow fall? When did it melt? How dry was the ground? How hot was spring? How low were the reservoirs before runoff began? How much water was needed downstream before the runoff arrived? How close did the system come to a power or release threshold? A system built around totals is being stressed by timing. That is why the 3.2 million acre-feet plan cannot be judged only by its size. The plan matters. It is large. It may buy time. It may protect reservoir elevations. It may prevent harsher federal action in the short term. But the real question is not only how much water is saved. The real question is when it is saved, where it is stored, who is required to conserve, whether the conservation is durable, and whether it arrives before the system crosses thresholds that are hard to reverse. 1 million acre-feet left in the system after a threshold is crossed does not carry the same value as 1 million acre-feet conserved before the threshold. Timing changes the meaning of the same number. This is the part that gets lost when the conflict is described as a simple dispute between Upper Basin and Lower Basin states. The Upper Basin looks at the river and sees headwaters, snowpack, future development, and fear that downstream demand will force upstream sacrifices. The Lower Basin looks at the river and sees enormous existing dependence, senior rights, desert cities, irrigation empires, and the immediate risk that Lake Mead and Lake Powell will fall into more dangerous zones. Both sides are arguing about fairness, but beneath fairness is sequence. Who cuts before the next dry winter? Who cuts before the next operating decision? Who cuts before Lake Powell loses more elevation? Who cuts before Lake Mead is pushed closer to deeper shortage tiers? Who cuts before the Bureau of Reclamation has to impose a rule that one side considers unacceptable? This is not only politics. It is politics under hydrologic pressure. The phrase deadlock can make the crisis sound frozen. It suggests people standing still in a room, refusing to move. But the river is not frozen. The reservoirs are moving. The snow season is moving. The evaporation season is moving. The planting season is moving. Cities are moving through another summer. Legal deadlines are moving. That is what makes this deadlock different from an ordinary negotiation. The table may be stalled, but the system around the table is advancing. The more accurate image is not a dry riverbed. It is a set of clocks drifting apart inside the same wall. One clock is legal. One is climatic. One is agricultural. One is urban. One is electrical. One is ecological. For decades, reservoirs made the clocks appear synchronized. They absorbed bad timing. They carried water from one year to another. They allowed law to pretend that variability could be domesticated. Now the reservoirs themselves are low enough that they cannot hide the mismatch as well as before. That is the real twist. The Colorado River crisis is not only a shortage of water, it is a shortage of timing, storage, trust, and room for error. And when a river system loses room for error, the question changes. It is no longer whether each state can defend its claim. It is whether the system can survive everyone defending their claim at the same time. The mechanism at the center of this crisis has a simple name, even if the system around it is complicated. It is a reservoir deficit trap. That means the river is no longer only suffering from a bad year, or even a string of bad years. It means the storage system that was built to absorb dry years has itself become part of the emergency. The reservoirs were supposed to be shock absorbers. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were built to catch the irregular pulse of the Colorado River and convert it into something steadier, something cities could plan around, farms could plant around, and power systems could schedule around. But when the shocks keep coming, the absorber wears down. The first step begins far above the desert. It begins as snow. The Colorado River is often imagined as a desert river because so much of its water is used in desert cities and farms. But much of its supply starts in mountain snowpack. Snow is water held in slow motion. It falls in winter, waits in cold air, then releases in spring and early summer. That delayed release is what makes the river manageable. It turns mountain weather into reservoir inflow months later. A warmer climate changes the character of that storage. More heat means some precipitation can fall as rain instead of snow. Snow that does accumulate can melt earlier. Spring can arrive with soils already dry from previous heat. Then the first meltwater does not rush cleanly into streams. It enters ground that behaves like a sponge that has been left in the sun. Before the river receives the water, the land takes its share. This is the part that most people never see. The river can lose water before it looks like a river. A snowfield melts. The water enters forest soil. Roots pull some of it upward. Warmer air pulls moisture from leaves through evapotranspiration, the combined process of evaporation from land and water, plus transpiration from plants. Some water stays in the soil, some refills shallow groundwater, some moves slowly. Only part of it becomes runoff that reaches a creek, then a tributary, then the Colorado River, then Lake Powell. So a winter can look better than the reservoir later feels. Snow on a mountain is not the same as usable water in a dam. Between those 2 points is an invisible corridor of loss. That corridor is getting more important. Scientific studies of the Colorado River Basin have found that warming reduces runoff efficiency, meaning the same amount of precipitation can produce less stream flow. A major study, published in Water Resources Research, found that the basin has roughly 10% less water available under present-day warming conditions compared with a cooler historical baseline, with snowpack regions especially sensitive to heat. The mechanism is not mysterious. Warmer air demands more water. Dry soils take more water. Vegetation can use more water. The atmosphere becomes a larger claimant on the river before the law ever begins to divide it. That is the first turn of the trap. Heat makes the river smaller before any human diversion occurs. The second turn happens inside the reservoirs. When inflow is weak, Lake Powell and Lake Mead fall. At first, that looks like a visual problem. Exposed rock, stranded docks, longer ramps, a white mineral ring on canyon walls. But for water managers, the problem is not aesthetic. It is operational. A reservoir needs elevation to do its work. Elevation creates pressure. Pressure helps move water through turbines. Elevation creates storage margin. Margin gives managers choices. When the lake is high, the system can absorb mistakes. When the lake is low, mistakes become decisions. Lake Powell has a threshold called minimum power pool, the level below which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably generate hydropower. The dam does not vanish at that point. The reservoir does not become empty. But one of the system's central functions begins to fail. The water is still there in some amount, yet it is no longer in the right physical position to do all the things society expects from it. That is why a reservoir is not a bucket. A bucket is useful until it is empty. A reservoir is useful only while its elevation remains within an operating range. Below that range, water supply, power generation, release capacity, and downstream reliability begin to separate from one another. This is the second turn of the trap. Low water reduces the system's ability to manage low water. The third turn is political. If Lake Powell falls too far, managers may reduce releases downstream to protect the dam's power and infrastructure functions. But reduced releases to Lake Mead can push Lake Mead lower. Lake Mead is the crucial reservoir for much of the lower basin. It supports deliveries to Arizona, California, Nevada, and Mexico. Protecting one reservoir can increase pressure on the other. Sending more water downstream can protect Mead, but weaken Powell. Holding water upstream can protect Powell, but intensify lower basin shortages. The river becomes a balance beam with a reservoir at each end. That is why the states are deadlocked. They are not simply arguing over who deserves water. They are arguing over where the risk should sit. Should the risk be held at Lake Powell, where hydropower and upstream operations are threatened? Should it be pushed toward Lake Mead, where lower basin users face deeper shortages? Should conservation be mandatory or voluntary? Should reductions be based on legal priority, recent use, equal pain, reservoir elevation, or some hybrid formula that every side can barely accept? The reservoir deficit trap turns every technical decision into a fairness dispute. Then the trap moves outward, into the human system. Consider a farmer who receives Colorado River water through an irrigation district. The farmer does not experience the crisis as a graph of reservoir elevation. The crisis arrives as uncertainty before planting. It arrives as a question about whether a field should be planted, partially planted, leased into a conservation program, or left dry. If the field is left dry, water may be saved for the reservoir. But the saved water also travels through a local economy as absence. There may be fewer workers called in, less equipment used, less seed purchased, less feed produced, less revenue circulating through a rural town. The mechanism has moved from snow to soil, from soil to runoff, from runoff to reservoir, from reservoir to canal, from canal to field, from field to paycheck. That is what makes the crisis systemic. A conservation decision can protect a dam and weaken a community at the same time. A release decision can protect one reservoir and endanger another. An urban restriction can save water and still leave the deepest imbalance untouched if agriculture, law, and climate remain unresolved. A hydropower loss can raise electricity costs or shift demand to other sources during the same hot periods when water demand is also rising. The river does not fail in one place. It transfers pressure. This is also why the phrase, "save water," needs careful handling. Saving water is necessary. It may be the only way to prevent more dangerous reservoir declines in the near term. But saving water inside a reservoir deficit trap is different from saving water in a stable system. In a stable system, conservation creates breathing room. In a trapped system, conservation may only slow the rate at which breathing room disappears. That does not make conservation meaningless. It makes it urgent and incomplete. The lower basin proposal, to save more than 3.2 million acre-feet through 2028, is a serious attempt to place a brace under the system. It could keep more water in storage. It could delay harsher cuts. It could protect critical elevations. It could show that states with enormous competing demands can still produce measurable reductions. But a brace is not the same as a rebuilt foundation. The foundation problem is that the Colorado River has been asked to behave like a larger, cooler, more reliable river than the one now arriving. This is the hidden mechanism behind the deadlock. The basin is not only short of water, it is short of stored time. Reservoirs are stored time. Snowpack is stored time. Groundwater is stored time. Legal agreements are attempts to organize time by promising future deliveries. When those forms of storage weaken together, the system loses the ability to postpone consequences. For decades, a dry year could be softened by storage. A bad runoff season could be answered with releases. A city could grow because the reservoir still looked large enough. A farm district could keep planting because the canal still delivered. The danger was delayed, and because it was delayed, it felt less real. Now, delay itself is running out. The reservoir deficit trap can be pictured as a heavy door closing slowly. At first, there is space to move. Then the gap narrows. The same action that would have been easy earlier becomes harder later. A small cut made early may protect flexibility. A larger cut, made late, may only prevent immediate damage. The timing changes the power of the solution. That is why 3.2 million acre-feet matters, but also why it cannot be treated as a final answer. In a system near thresholds, the question is not only how much water is conserved, it is whether the conservation comes before the door closes further. The actual mechanism is not dramatic in the movie sense. There is no single wall of water, no sudden crack across the dam, no instant collapse of a city. It is quieter than that. Snow melts into thirsty ground. A reservoir drops a few more feet. A power projection worsens. A release is reconsidered. A farmer waits. A city adjusts. A tribe negotiates. A federal agency prepares another operating plan. A state hardens its position because the next concession may become the new baseline. Then everyone calls it a water fight because that is easier than calling it what it is. It is a storage system losing its shock absorbers in a hotter world. And once that is understood, the crisis looks different. The question is no longer whether the Colorado River has enough water for every promise made to it in the past. The question is how many functions can still be protected as the old buffer disappears. Because the trap does not close when the river is empty. It closes when the system can no longer use the water it has to keep all its promises at once. The Colorado River has been here before, but never in exactly this shape. That distinction matters. Drought is not new in the American West. Conflict over water is not new. The Colorado River has always carried more than water. It has carried ambition, engineering, agriculture, law, empire, settlement, and the belief that a dry region could be made predictable if enough concrete, paperwork, and political force were applied to it. The first great precedent is the Colorado River Compact of 1922. That compact divided the river between the upper basin and the lower basin. Each basin was assigned 7.5 million acre-feet per year. On paper, the arrangement looked like order. It gave the river a legal architecture. It gave states a way to plan. It gave investors, farmers, cities, and dam builders a foundation beneath their decisions. But the foundation had a flaw buried inside it. The compact was shaped during an unusually wet period. The river that negotiators believed they were dividing was more generous than the river that long-term records would later reveal. At Lee Ferry, the assumed average flow was often treated as roughly 16.4 million acre-feet per year. The compact allocated 15 million acre-feet between the two basins, before later obligations to Mexico were fully layered into the system. It looked cautious at the time. It looks dangerous in retrospect. This is the first historical lesson. A water system can be overbuilt not because the engineers fail, but because the climate record chosen as normal is not normal. The mistake did not explode immediately because reservoirs hid it. That is what reservoirs do. They make a bad assumption, survivable for a while. They store wet years. They soften dry years. They allow cities to grow and farms to expand, while the deeper arithmetic remains out of sight. Then came the Great Dam Age. Hoover Dam created Lake Mead. Glen Canyon Dam created Lake Powell. Together, they became the giant lungs of the system, inhaling surplus and exhaling reliability. They helped turn a volatile river into a managed supply line. They made the desert look more certain than it was. For much of the 20th century, that confidence held. Not perfectly, but enough. The reservoirs created margin. The legal system created order. The river moved through canals and turbines with the authority of infrastructure. The public learned to see the Colorado River not as a climate-sensitive mountain river, but as a dependable machine. Then the machine began to meet a different atmosphere. The drought that began around the turn of the century became the second great precedent. It was not only dry, it was hot. Researchers Brad Udall and Jonathan Overpeck described the 21st century Colorado River drought as a hot drought, showing that from 2000 through 2014, annual flows averaged about 19% below the 20th century average. That finding matters because it separates this crisis from a simple rain shortage. Heat was not background noise. Heat was part of the mechanism. A cool drought and a hot drought do not behave the same way. In a cool drought, precipitation may be low, but the atmosphere's thirst is less aggressive. In a hot drought, the air pulls harder, soil dries faster, snowpack melts differently, plants and exposed ground return more moisture to the sky. The basin can receive some precipitation and still send less runoff into the river. Heat turns drought from an absence into an active force. That is why the history of the Colorado River is not just a history of low rainfall. It is a history of assumptions being exposed by temperature. The next precedent came in 2007, when the federal government adopted interim guidelines for managing shortages and coordinating the operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. These rules were meant to provide predictability through the end of the current operating period. They were a bridge. They created shortage tiers. They linked reservoir elevations to action. They helped define when and how reductions would begin in the lower basin. At the time, this looked like adaptation. And in one sense, it was. The system recognized that shortage could no longer be treated as a distant possibility. It needed a rulebook. But a rulebook written for one level of stress can become insufficient under a deeper level of stress. That is what happened. The 2007 guidelines did not end the problem. They formalized the first layer of response. As the drought continued, the river kept asking harder questions. Then came the drought contingency plans in 2019. The name itself tells the story. Contingency, not normal operation, not long-term redesign. A contingency plan is what a system writes when ordinary rules no longer feel safe enough. The Upper Basin Plan focused on reducing the risk that Lake Powell would fall to critical elevations and on protecting the ability to comply with the compact. The Lower Basin Plan added contributions and reductions meant to keep Lake Mead from falling too fast. It was another brace under the beam. Necessary, serious, but still temporary. That is the pattern. 1922 created the promise. The dam era stored the promise. 2007 adjusted the promise. 2019 defended the promise. Now the post-2026 negotiations are asking whether the promise itself must be redefined. This is why the present deadlock feels different from older disputes. In the past, negotiations often happened with more storage behind them. Lake Mead and Lake Powell were stressed, but they still offered more room for delay. The system could argue and still survive the argument. Today, the reservoirs are lower, the climate is hotter, and the margin is thinner. Delay is no longer just political. Delay has a water level. There is another precedent, older and darker than the modern legal documents. The history of megadroughts in the southwest. Tree ring studies show that the region has experienced severe droughts before modern measurement began. The current drought is not proof that the West has never been dry. That would be false. The West has always known dryness. The difference is that earlier megadroughts did not strike a basin carrying tens of millions of people, millions of irrigated acres, giant reservoirs, hydropower dependence, tribal claims, interstate law, international obligations, and cities built around imported water. A natural drought becomes a disaster through exposure. That is the lesson from other water crises too. The Aral Sea did not shrink only because water disappeared from the sky. It shrank because human withdrawals overwhelmed the system. The Murray-Darling Basin in Australia did not become a warning only because of dry years. It became a warning because law, farming, ecology, and politics struggled to fit within a variable river. Cape Town's Day Zero crisis was not only about low reservoirs. It was about demand, infrastructure, timing, public behavior, and governance under pressure. The Colorado River is not identical to those cases. The script must not pretend that it is. But the family resemblance is important. Water crises usually do not arrive as a single cause. They arrive as a collision between climate stress and human design. That is what history proves here. The Colorado River crisis is not imaginary. It is not a sudden panic invented by one agency, one state, or one political faction. It is the latest stage in a long sequence. An overestimated river, a century of growth, a warming basin, temporary rules, emergency conservation, and now a negotiation in which every side can point to history and claim both injury and right. The lower basin can say it has built a measurable conservation plan and is ready to save more than 3.2 million acre-feet. The upper basin can say the lower river has depended for too long on uses that exceed the river's new reality. Tribes can say the system has repeatedly discussed shortages while leaving unresolved the infrastructure needed to use rights that were promised long ago. Cities can say they have already conserved and cannot be treated as endless sources of cuts. Farmers can say, a dry field is not an abstraction, but a broken income stream. History does not make the decision easier. It makes the decision harder because it gives every party evidence. But it also gives the viewer clarity. This is not the first warning. The compact was a warning, though few saw it that way. The falling reservoirs were a warning. The 2007 guidelines were a warning. The 2019 drought plans were a warning. The studies on hot drought were a warning. Each one said the same thing in a different language. The river being managed on paper is larger than the river arriving in water. That is the comparison with the present. Earlier agreements tried to stretch the old system a little farther. The current deadlock asks whether stretching is still enough. Earlier plans bought time. The current plan buys time again. But time is becoming more expensive. 3.2 million acre-feet now stands where smaller measures once stood. That is the historical signal. The river is not suddenly in crisis because the states failed to agree this week. The crisis is that the states are trying to agree after a century of decisions that made agreement harder. Every canal, every field, every subdivision, every dam, every contract, and every postponed reform is now sitting at the table. That is why this moment should not be dismissed as another Western water fight. It is a test of whether a legal system built around past abundance can be revised fast enough for present scarcity. The Colorado River has survived dry centuries before, but the system built on top of it has not. The weakest layer of the Colorado River crisis is not the river channel itself. It is the places where water turns into dependency. A canal looks strong from the outside. Concrete walls, steel gates, pumping stations, control rooms, and long straight lines across the desert all create the feeling of command. The Central Arizona project looks especially impossible to the eye. A massive aqueduct lifting Colorado River water from the western edge of Arizona and carrying it hundreds of miles toward Phoenix and Tucson. The All-American Canal looks like an engineered answer to the desert itself, carrying water into Imperial Valley, where fields exist because the river has been redirected with precision. But the more precise a system becomes, the more exposed it can be when the input changes. The first vulnerable part is not dramatic. It is the delivery schedule. Water does not simply arrive. It is ordered, measured, released, pumped, diverted, exchanged, stored, and accounted for. A shortage does not have to destroy a canal to damage the people connected to it. It only has to change the reliability of the order. In Arizona, the Central Arizona project has already become one of the clearest examples of how vulnerability travels through priority. Under shortage rules, Arizona has taken major reductions, and those reductions have fallen heavily on Central Arizona project users. The reason is not that Arizona is uniquely careless. It is because parts of its Colorado River supply have lower priority than older uses in California and along the river. In water law, age can become armor. Senior rights stand closer to the front of the line. Junior rights stand closer to the cut. That means the weak point is not only a pipe or a pump. It is a legal ranking inside the infrastructure. For a city, the impact may first appear as planning. Water agencies adjust portfolios. More groundwater is stored. More reclaimed water is used. More conservation campaigns appear. Grass is removed. Developers face new questions. Households hear that supply is secure, but only because layers of backup are being activated behind the scenes. For agriculture, the impact can be faster and harsher. A farm cannot conserve in the abstract. It conserves by changing a crop, upgrading equipment, reducing acreage, fallowing land, or accepting payment not to irrigate. Each choice moves through the local economy. A dry field may save water in a reservoir, but it can also remove work from irrigators, truck drivers, harvest crews, seed suppliers, mechanics, packing facilities, and nearby stores. The saved acre-foot is visible on a spreadsheet. The missing paycheck is harder to count. This is why the crisis is more dangerous than the headline number. 3.2 million acre-feet sounds like water, But on the ground, it can mean 1,000 smaller decisions about land, labor, debt, and survival. The river is not only being cut from users, it is being cut through communities. Imperial Valley shows the contradiction most clearly. It is one of the most productive agricultural regions tied to the Colorado River, and it holds some of the most powerful water rights in the lower basin. From a distance, that can make the valley look protected, but protection is not the same as immunity. If the system demands large conservation, the places with large allocations become targets, because that is where large water volumes can be found. The valley is often discussed as if it was simply a water bank for the rest of the West. But Imperial Valley is also a place where water becomes winter vegetables, cattle feed, wages, tax revenue, school funding, and identity. Fallowing land may be necessary in some years. It may even be one of the fastest ways to keep water in Lake Mead. But if fallowing becomes a permanent pressure without a serious plan for the community around it, then conservation can begin to resemble extraction. The water stays in the system. The cost leaves through people. That is the hidden social layer of drought. A reservoir can be measured every day. A town hollowed by uncertainty is measured more slowly. The next vulnerable layer is tribal water access. Tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin hold significant rights, and in many cases, those rights are among the most important unresolved pieces of the basin's future. But a right on paper does not automatically become water in a home, a farm, a business, or a treatment system. Infrastructure has to exist. Pipes have to be built. Claims have to be quantified. Settlements have to be funded. Governance has to be respected. When shortage negotiations accelerate, unresolved tribal water issues become even more urgent. A basin can talk about conservation, efficiency, and sacrifice. While some communities are still fighting for the basic infrastructure needed to use water that should have been secured long ago, that is not a side story. It is central to the moral structure of the river. A system that asks who must give up water has to ask who never received full access in the first place. The same vulnerability appears in groundwater. When surface water becomes less reliable, users often turn downward. Groundwater becomes the hidden reservoir beneath the visible one. Cities bank it, farms pump it. Rural households depend on wells. But groundwater is not an endless backup. In some places, pumping lowers water tables, raises costs, damages land, and shifts the burden onto people who do not have the money to drill deeper. The Colorado River crisis can therefore move underground, where it becomes quieter and harder to govern. The public may see a Colorado River shortage and assume it is only about the river. But in a connected water system, pressure rarely stays where it begins. A river cut can become a groundwater decline. A groundwater decline can become a well failure. A well failure can become a household crisis. A household crisis can become a public health problem. The mechanism walks from infrastructure into the body. Then there is the electric system. Hydropower from the Colorado River is not the largest source of electricity in the West, but it is valuable because it can respond quickly and because dams are part of a broader operating system. When reservoirs drop, hydropower becomes less reliable. When hydropower weakens during hot periods, other power sources must cover more demand. When extreme heat increases electricity use for cooling, the water and power systems begin leaning on each other at exactly the wrong time. This is what systemic risk looks like. One shortage does not stay in one column. A low reservoir is a water problem. It is also a power problem. It is also an agricultural problem. It is also a tribal sovereignty problem. It is also a food supply problem. It is also a housing and growth problem. It is also a public finance problem for small communities whose economies depend on irrigated land. The Colorado River is not a single lifeline. It is a bundle of lifelines tied together, and some people have more slack in that bundle than others. A wealthy city can pay for conservation programs, recycling, desalination partnerships, groundwater storage, legal teams, and long-term planning. A large irrigation district can negotiate directly with state and federal officials. A senior water rights holder may have more protection than a junior user. A metropolitan agency may have engineers and lawyers ready for every rule change. A small community may have a well, an aging pipe, a limited tax base, and no spare money. This is why the crisis cannot be understood only through acre-feet. Acre-feet measure volume, not vulnerability. 1 acre-foot taken from a water-rich portfolio is not the same as 1 acre-foot taken from a town with no backup. 1 fallowed field in a compensated program is not the same as an entire local economy drifting toward permanent contraction. 1 urban lawn removed from a wealthy neighborhood is not the same as a tribal household waiting for safe running water. Equal volume is not equal pain. That is the hardest truth inside the negotiations. The basin needs real reductions. The math does not allow everyone to continue as before. But the design of the reductions will decide whether the burden lands like policy or like abandonment. If cuts are rushed, the most vulnerable users may be treated as rounding errors. If cuts are delayed, the reservoirs may lose more margin and force harsher actions later. If cuts are voluntary, the system may not save enough. If cuts are mandatory, the legal battles may intensify. If money is used to buy conservation, it may help stabilize the system, but it may also turn water into a marketplace where communities with less bargaining power lose control over their future. There is no painless version of this, but there are more honest versions and less honest versions. An honest version admits that the Colorado River crisis is not only a fight between states, it is a stress test of the smallest working parts of the West. A planting window, a canal turnout, a groundwater well, a tribal settlement, a hydropower threshold, a rural payroll, a household water connection, a city's backup supply. Those are the places where the system can fracture. Not all at once, not everywhere, not in a single cinematic collapse, but through a series of decisions that appear manageable from a distance and life-changing up close. That is why the deadlock matters so much. Every month of uncertainty is absorbed somewhere, by a reservoir, by a farmer, by a planner, by a tribe, by a household, by a field left dry, by a well drilled deeper, by a community told to wait. The Colorado River does not only reveal how much water is missing, it reveals who has been living closest to the edge of the system all along. The Colorado River deadlock is bigger than water. That is the point where the story has to widen. A river can begin as hydrology, but after a century of engineering and settlement, it becomes a system. The Colorado River is not only a line of blue on a map, it is a food machine, a power machine, a growth machine, a legal machine, a tribal sovereignty question, an international treaty obligation, and a climate warning. When that machine loses margin, the crisis does not stay inside the banks of the river. It moves outward through everything that was built on the assumption that the river would continue to behave within a known range. This is why the phrase, water shortage, is too small. A shortage sounds like a missing amount. It sounds like a deficit that can be solved by finding more, using less, or waiting for rain. But the Colorado River is showing something more complex. It is showing what happens when a system's response capacity begins to overload. The reservoirs are not just lower, the rules are expiring, the states are divided. Federal agencies are being forced to evaluate alternatives under pressure. Tribes are still negotiating unresolved claims and infrastructure gaps. Cities are planning around uncertainty. Farmers are being asked to turn water into conservation credits, temporary payments, or dry ground. This is not a shortage sitting still. It is a shortage moving through institutions. The post-2026 process is the clearest signal. The Bureau of Reclamation is not simply updating an old manual. It is trying to write operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead in a world where the previous assumptions no longer hold with the same force. The current guidelines were built as interim rules. Interim means temporary. It means the system was buying time. Now that borrowed time is ending, and the basin is trying to decide what replaces it. That replacement is not just a technical formula, it is the future grammar of the river. How much water is released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead? How reservoir elevations trigger reductions? how the burden is shared between upper basin and lower basin states, how climate uncertainty is included, how low the reservoirs can fall before emergency discretion increases, how tribal rights are respected, how Mexico is included, how conservation is counted, how voluntary reductions become enforceable trust. These are not details. These are the rules by which millions of people will experience water security or water stress. A system is overloaded when every decision begins to carry too many consequences. That is what is happening here. If more water is released from Powell, Lake Mead may receive relief, but Powell may move closer to dangerous operating levels. If less water is released from Powell, the upper basin may protect upstream infrastructure, but the lower basin may face deeper shortages. If cuts are assigned by legal priority, some junior users face severe disruption while senior users remain protected. If cuts are assigned more evenly, older legal structures are challenged. If reductions depend on voluntary conservation, the basin may not save enough. If reductions become mandatory, the courts may become another arena of drought. Every path has a cost. Every delay has a cost. Even agreement has a cost. That is why this event belongs inside a larger pattern. Across the world, modern societies are discovering that climate stress does not only damage natural systems, it exposes the assumptions inside human systems. A heat wave does not only raise temperature, it tests hospitals, power grids, labor rules, housing quality, and the human body's ability to cool overnight. A flood does not only bring water, it tests storm drains, roads, insurance, emergency alerts, and where poor neighborhoods were built. A drought does not only reduce rainfall, it tests groundwater, crop choices, food prices, water law, and political trust. The Colorado River is the drought version of that same lesson. The old baseline said that reservoirs could smooth extremes. It said that legal allocations could organize scarcity. It said that engineering could stretch a river across deserts and still leave enough flexibility for bad years. It said that population growth, agriculture, hydropower, and recreation could all be balanced by a system large enough to absorb conflict. That baseline did not require the river to be perfect. It only required the river to remain close enough to the 20th century range that storage and law could cover the difference. The new baseline is harsher. In the new baseline, heat is not an occasional amplifier. It is part of the operating environment. Dry soil is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a competitor for runoff. Low reservoirs are not rare warnings. They are conditions that can persist long enough to reshape policy. Conservation is not a public relations goal. It is becoming a structural requirement. And deadlock is not only embarrassing, it is dangerous because the physical system keeps moving while the political system waits. That is the essence of systemic risk. The disaster is not only that one part fails, the disaster is that the parts begin to protect themselves against each other. A city tries to secure its supply. A farm district tries to protect its rights. An upper basin state tries to preserve future development. A lower basin state tries to protect existing dependence. A dam operator tries to protect critical elevations. A tribe tries to secure water, promised but not fully delivered. A federal agency tries to prevent collapse without triggering endless litigation. Each actor behaves rationally inside its own frame. But when the shared resource is shrinking, rational self-protection can become collective danger. The river becomes a test of governance under contraction. Growth was easier to govern. Growth allowed compromise to hide inside expansion. If there was more demand, more infrastructure could be built. If there was more population, more water could be imported, stored, pumped, reused, or promised. If one group gained, another could be told that future projects would make room. Scarcity removes that escape route. Scarcity makes the old promise impossible, that everyone can keep the future they expected. This is why the Colorado River negotiations feel so tense. The states are not only arguing over water use through 2028, they are arguing over whether the next era will still protect the old hierarchy of claims, or whether the hydrology has become so severe that the hierarchy itself must bend. That is a political question, a legal question, and a moral question at the same time. It is also an infrastructure question. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were designed as enormous buffers. Their size created the illusion that the system had almost unlimited patience. But when storage falls near critical thresholds, the buffer stops feeling infinite. The system begins to require faster and more precise decisions. The same bureaucracy that once operated in multi-year planning cycles must now respond to forecasts, inflow probabilities, emergency elevations, litigation threats, and shifting state proposals. The response system can become overloaded, not because officials do nothing, but because every action is partial. A release decision does not solve demand. A conservation payment does not solve climate warming. A legal settlement does not fill a reservoir. A wet winter does not erase overuse. A dry winter can undo years of planning. An emergency plan can prevent immediate danger, while reinforcing the expectation that another emergency plan will arrive later. The basin becomes trapped in a cycle of temporary rescue. That cycle is one definition of a new baseline, when emergency measures stop being exceptional and become part of normal management. This is not to say that the Colorado River is doomed. That would be too simple, and it would ignore the real conservation already achieved. Las Vegas has reduced per capita water use dramatically. Arizona has built groundwater storage and absorbed major cuts. California agricultural districts have participated in conservation programs. Tribes, cities, farmers, and states have all advanced proposals that would have been politically unthinkable in earlier decades. The system is not passive, it is learning, but the harder question is whether it is learning fast enough. A system can adapt and still fall behind. That is the uncomfortable middle ground. It is possible for officials to work seriously, for states to negotiate intensely, for users to conserve real water, and for the river to remain in danger because the pace of environmental change and historical overuse outruns the pace of institutional adjustment. That is the story hidden inside the deadlock. The issue is not whether people understand that the river is stressed. They do. The issue is whether understanding can become enforceable action before the reservoirs lose more flexibility. The issue is whether a basin built around allocation can become a basin built around risk management. The issue is whether water law can move from defending old claims to protecting shared function. Shared function is the key phrase. The Colorado River does not need every user to feel satisfied. That may no longer be possible. It needs the system to keep functioning. Water for public health, enough reservoir elevation for safe operations, enough agricultural transition to avoid rural collapse, enough tribal inclusion to correct long-standing injustice, enough urban conservation to make growth honest, enough ecological flow to keep the river from becoming only plumbing, enough trust to prevent every shortage from becoming a lawsuit. That is a different vision from the old one. The old vision asked how to divide the river. The new vision asks how to keep the river system from breaking while using less than many users were promised. This is why the Colorado River matters beyond the Southwest. It is a case study in the future of climate-era infrastructure. Around the world, roads, reservoirs, ports, grids, drains, insurance systems, and food networks are being forced to operate outside the climate ranges that shaped their design. The danger is not always sudden destruction. Sometimes the danger is a slow narrowing of options until each new shock costs more to absorb. The Colorado River is showing that future in water. The dams still stand, the canals still carry water, the cities still grow, the fields still produce. The agencies still issue studies, the states still negotiate. From the outside, the system can look intact, but an intact system can still be under structural stress. That is the meaning of the 3.2 million acre-feet plan inside the larger story. It is not only a conservation proposal, it is a sign that the basin has entered an era where very large reductions are required simply to maintain temporary stability. It is a sign that water management is no longer about returning to normal after drought. It is about defining what normal means when drought, heat, and overuse have changed the river's baseline. And once that is understood, the deadlock stops looking like a delay in paperwork. It starts looking like a rehearsal for the future of infrastructure under climate pressure. This is the point in the story where the facts have to be separated from the noise. Because a crisis like the Colorado River invites exaggeration. It invites political slogans. It invites simple villains. It invites the easiest sentence in any drought. Climate change did it. It also invites the opposite mistake. This is just bad management. And climate has nothing to do with it. Both shortcuts are wrong. The Colorado River crisis is not a single cause event. It is not a mystery either. It is a collision between a hotter, drier operating environment and a human system that has promised more water than the river can reliably deliver. To understand what is real, the viewer has to hold several truths at the same time, without forcing them into one neat explanation. The first truth is that climate is deeply related to this crisis. A warmer atmosphere changes the river before the water reaches a dam. Heat increases evaporation from reservoirs, rivers, soils, and fields. It increases the water demand of vegetation. It can reduce snowpack, shift snowmelt earlier, and make dry soils absorb more runoff before that water reaches streams. This means that even when precipitation arrives, less of it may become usable river flow. The Colorado River is not only receiving less water in some years. It is losing efficiency in the journey from sky to stream. That is real. The Bureau of Reclamation's warnings about Lake Powell and critical reservoir elevations are not based on rumor. They are based on hydrology, forecasts, reservoir storage, and operating thresholds. When officials warn that Lake Powell may fall below minimum power pool without intervention, that is not a metaphor. It is an engineering risk tied to the elevation needed for Glen Canyon Dam to generate hydropower reliably. The lake does not have to be empty for a major function to be threatened. That is real too. But climate change alone does not explain the deadlock. The second truth is that overuse and legal structure are also central. The Colorado River was divided under rules and expectations shaped by an older view of the river. For decades, cities, farms, dams, canals, and economies grew around allocations that assumed a level of reliability the modern river no longer consistently provides. The system did not become vulnerable only because the climate warmed. It became vulnerable because warming arrived on top of long-term dependence, legal complexity, and demand that was already difficult to reconcile with supply. This matters because blaming only climate can hide human choices. It can make the crisis feel like weather acting on innocent infrastructure. But infrastructure has a history. Crops were chosen, cities expanded, rights were negotiated, reservoirs were operated. Shortages were postponed. Groundwater was used as a backup. Conservation was delayed in some places and accelerated in others. The river was not simply consumed by heat. It was committed, diverted, and depended upon. That is real. The third truth is that the current 3.2 million acre-feet plan should not be described as either a guaranteed rescue or a meaningless gesture. It is neither. The lower basin proposal is substantial. More than 3.2 million acre-feet through 2028 is a major volume of water. It could protect reservoir elevations, reduce near-term pressure, and show that Arizona, California, and Nevada can coordinate around measurable conservation. It may help prevent more disruptive federal actions in the short term. Dismissing it as nothing would be inaccurate, but treating it as a cure would also be inaccurate. It is a short-term plan inside a long-term imbalance. It can buy time. It cannot guarantee the next snowpack. It cannot permanently resolve upper basin and lower basin conflict. It cannot by itself settle tribal water rights, redesign agricultural economies, or rewrite the law of the river. It cannot make a hotter basin behave like a cooler one. The plan is real. The limit of the plan is also real. The fourth truth is that not every dramatic image belongs to the same cause. A white bathtub ring around Lake Mead is related to long-term reservoir decline, drought, withdrawals, and operating decisions. It is a useful image, but it does not prove any single claim by itself. A low boat ramp does not explain the compact. A dry canal segment does not explain climate attribution. A fallowed field does not automatically mean a community has been sacrificed unfairly. A wet month does not mean the crisis is over. A snowstorm does not refill a century of structural overcommitment. Weather and climate also have to be separated carefully. One dry winter is not the same as long-term aridification. One wet year is not recovery. One low runoff forecast is not proof that every future year will be worse. One conservation deal is not proof that the basin has found permanent balance. The Colorado River story is built from patterns, thresholds, and accumulated stress, not from one image alone. That is the discipline this crisis requires. The fifth truth is that some claims remain uncertain. No one can honestly say exactly how much water the Colorado River will carry every year in the next decade. Forecasts can describe ranges and risks, but not certainty. No one can honestly say that one particular state proposal will prevent all future emergency measures. No one can honestly say that a single federal rule will be accepted without legal challenge. No one can honestly say that every acre-foot saved through compensated conservation will produce the same social outcome in every community. The uncertainty is not an excuse to do nothing. It is the reason decisions have to be robust. A fragile plan assumes one future. A serious plan works across many possible futures, including dry years, legal conflict, high heat, low snowpack, and rapid reservoir decline. That is what the post-2026 process is really testing. It is not testing whether the basin can write a document. It is testing whether the basin can design rules that still function when the future refuses to be average. The sixth truth is that some fears are exaggerated. The Colorado River is not about to vanish from every tap overnight. Las Vegas is not simply going to wake up without water because one negotiation stalls. Phoenix is not instantly abandoned because Lake Mead drops. California agriculture does not disappear because one conservation plan is approved. Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam are not fictional dams on the edge of movie collapse. Serious risks do not need cinematic language. Exaggeration damages trust. It makes the public easier to alarm and harder to inform. It also gives denial an opening. When claims become too extreme, opponents can attack the exaggeration and ignore the real problem beneath it. The real problem is enough. The real problem is that the reservoirs have lost storage margin. The real problem is that some operating thresholds are close enough to require intervention. The real problem is that demand and reliable supply are not aligned. The real problem is that the legal system still struggles to distribute sacrifice before crisis forces sharper action. The real problem is that communities with the least flexibility may absorb uncertainty long before wealthier users feel true shortage. That is a serious story without adding fiction. The seventh truth is that some things are connected only indirectly. A city approving new development in the Southwest is connected to water stress, but the connection depends on local supply portfolios, conservation rules, groundwater policy, and long-term planning. A data center using electricity in the region is connected to the water power system, but not every megawatt comes from Colorado River hydropower. A grocery price increase may be connected to drought and agricultural disruption, but food prices also move with labor, fuel, transport, fertilizer, and market conditions. This distinction matters. A good script does not turn every problem in the West into one river. The Colorado River is central, but it is not the only variable in every outcome. The goal is not to make the river responsible for everything. The goal is to show where the river is truly part of the mechanism. The strongest claim is not that the Colorado River explains the whole future of the West. The strongest claim is that it reveals the kind of future many systems are entering. That future is one where climate pressure exposes old promises. It exposes who has backup and who does not. It exposes which legal rules are flexible and which become traps. It exposes which infrastructure thresholds matter before the public notices. It exposes whether conservation is designed as shared transition or emergency extraction. It exposes whether science can still shape policy before politics hardens into litigation. That is the real risk. Not a single day when the river fails, not one dramatic collapse, not a countdown to zero. The real risk is a slow loss of optionality. The basin loses a little reservoir elevation, then it loses hydropower flexibility, then it loses trust between states, then it loses easy conservation, then it loses cheap solutions, then it loses the ability to pretend the next agreement can simply restore the old normal. In that sense, the most dangerous falsehood is not denial. It is nostalgia. The idea that the Colorado River can return to the old baseline if the basin just survives this round of negotiations is the softest and most dangerous illusion. A wet year can still come. Reservoirs can still rise. A deal can still be made. Conservation can still work. None of that means the old river has returned. It means the system has earned more time to adapt. So the honest conclusion is narrow, but powerful. Climate change is involved, but it is not the only cause. Overuse is involved, but it is not the only cause. Politics is involved, but politics is being forced by physical limits. The 3.2 million acre-feet plan matters, but it is not the final answer. The deadlock is dangerous, but it is not proof of inevitable collapse. The future is uncertain, but the direction of risk is clear. The Colorado River is not telling one simple story. It is telling several true stories at once, and the system will be judged by whether it can respond to all of them before the next threshold arrives. The story began with a number large enough to sound like an answer. 3.2 million acre-feet. A volume so large that it becomes difficult to picture as water. A trillion-gallon shape placed on a negotiating table. A promise to leave more water in a river system that is losing the margin it once used to hide its own imbalance. At the beginning, that number seemed to dominate the crisis. It sounded like the headline, the scale, the rescue plan, the measure by which the next chapter of the Colorado River would be judged. But by the end, the number looks different. It is still large. It still matters. It may still prevent worse outcomes in the near term. It may protect reservoir elevations long enough for a broader agreement to take shape. It may keep Lake Mead and Lake Powell farther from the thresholds that turn water scarcity into operational danger. It may prove that states with enormous competing interests can still act when the physical system demands action. But it is not the whole story. The deeper story is that the Colorado River has become a mirror. It reflects what happens when a society builds around one climate expectation and then has to govern under another. It reflects what happens when law moves more slowly than heat, when reservoirs lose the ability to absorb political delay, when a river, divided by old promises, begins arriving in smaller and less reliable form. It reflects the difference between a shortage that can be managed and a baseline that has moved. That is the message at the center of this crisis. The Colorado River is not simply asking the states to save water. It is asking them to admit that the old math no longer works without sacrifice. That admission is hard because water is never only water. It is land. It is power. It is food. It is inheritance. It is growth. It is sovereignty. It is the difference between a field planted and a field left bare, between a reservoir with options and a reservoir near a threshold, between a city plan that feels confident and one that depends on conservation becoming permanent. Every acre-foot removed from use has a destination. Every acre-foot saved has a cost somewhere. This is why the conflict has lasted so long. The states are not failing to understand the problem. They understand it too well. Each side can see the same shrinking margin and fear a different kind of loss. The lower basin sees immediate dependence. It sees cities, farms, senior rights, massive canals, and Lake Mead. It sees a plan to conserve millions of acre-feet and asks why measurable action should be delayed. The upper basin sees headwaters, future growth, smaller current use, upstream reservoirs, and the fear of being forced into reductions for a deficit it argues was built downstream. Tribal nations see a river discussed in terms of cuts, while many promises of access, infrastructure, and sovereignty remain unfinished. Farmers see land that cannot be switched off without consequences. Cities see residents who expect taps to work in a hotter future. Federal officials see a system that cannot be allowed to drift until the reservoirs make the decision for everyone. The deadlock is not empty politics. It is the sound of a basin discovering that every solution is also a redistribution of risk. And still, the river continues. That is the haunting part. The Colorado River does not stop while people argue about it. Snow falls or fails to fall. Soil dries or absorbs the runoff. Heat arrives, reservoirs rise or drop. Turbines gain pressure or lose it. Fields are planted or fallowed. Canal orders are made. Groundwater is pumped. Cities approve plans. Agencies publish studies. Lawyers prepare positions. Families pay bills. Workers wait for seasons that may not carry the same certainty they once did. The river keeps moving through the system, and the system keeps moving through people. That is why this ending cannot be a simple warning that everything is about to collapse. That would be too easy, and it would be wrong. The Colorado River Basin still has tools. It has conservation experience. It has cities that have reduced demand. It has farmers who know how to manage water with precision. It has tribes whose full inclusion could make future governance more just and more realistic. It has scientists who can read the system with increasing clarity. It has federal authority, state agencies, irrigation districts, legal frameworks, and a public that understands scarcity more than it did a generation ago. There is still room to act, but there is less room to pretend. That is the balance the ending has to hold. Not doom, not comfort. Something sharper than both. The Colorado River crisis is not the story of a single river dying in one dramatic moment. It is the story of a giant engineered system being forced to trade illusion for arithmetic. For much of the last century, storage made confidence possible. Lake Powell and Lake Mead made dry years seem manageable. Legal agreements made the river seem dividable. Canals made deserts seem secure. Growth made scarcity feel like a problem for later. Now later has arrived as an operating condition. The reservoirs are not just scenery in this story, they are the hourglass. Every foot of elevation is time. Every conservation plan is time. Every wet year is time. Every dry year spends time. Every delay asks the reservoirs to lend the basin more time. But reservoirs are not political institutions. They do not compromise. They do not extend deadlines because the parties are close. They do not care which state has the stronger argument. They record the balance between what enters and what leaves. That is why the white rings on canyon walls matter. They are not just marks of drought. They are marks of delayed decisions made visible in stone. The central question now is not whether the Colorado River can be saved in some sentimental sense. Rivers do not need sentiment. They need enough water, enough space, enough legal honesty, and enough restraint from the systems built around them. The question is whether the human structure attached to the river can become smaller, fairer, and more flexible before the physical structure loses more capacity. That question will not end with one proposal. Even if the 3.2 million acre-feet plan is accepted, the deeper negotiation remains. Even if the reservoirs gain temporary relief, the basin still has to decide what kind of future it is managing toward. A future where emergency conservation becomes routine. A future where every shortage becomes litigation. A future where the strongest legal claims survive and the weakest communities absorb the shock. Or a future where the basin admits that stability now requires planned transition instead of repeated rescue. That word matters: transition. A transition is different from a panic cut. A panic cut waits until the system is near a threshold and then removes water wherever it can. A transition asks earlier and harder questions. Which crops can change without destroying rural economies? Which cities can grow only if they prove real water neutrality? Which canals need repair? Which tribal water settlements need infrastructure, not just recognition? Which groundwater basins cannot be treated as hidden emergency accounts? Which reservoir elevations must be protected before they become crises? Which rights must be respected and which expectations must be revised? That is the work ahead. It will not be clean. It will not feel equal to everyone. It will produce lawsuits, anger, bargaining, and accusations of betrayal. But the alternative is not painless continuity. The alternative is a basin that keeps postponing hard choices until the choices arrive as emergency operations, deeper shortages, and smaller options. This is the future the Colorado River is pointing toward. Not a future without water. A future where water can no longer be assumed to arrive on the same terms. Not a future where every city fails. A future where every city must prove its dependence is honest. Not a future where agriculture disappears. A future where agriculture must be part of a water budget that can survive heat. Not a future where law becomes meaningless. A future where law must learn how to function when the river under it has changed. The event that began this story will eventually move on. A proposal will be accepted, rejected, revised, litigated, or folded into another agreement. A new runoff forecast will arrive. Another reservoir projection will be published. Another state official will say the talks are constructive. Another warning will be issued in careful federal language. The headlines will change. But the thing this event reveals will remain. A river system can be fully built and still be unprepared. A basin can have dams, canals, compacts, models, agencies, and experts, and still face a crisis because the hardest part of adaptation is not knowing that less water is coming. It is deciding who changes because of that knowledge. That is the part no reservoir can solve. The Colorado River is not asking for one heroic number. It is asking for a new relationship between climate, law, infrastructure, and demand. It is asking whether the West can stop treating temporary relief as proof that the old normal is returning. It is asking whether a society can make a planned retreat from overuse before nature imposes an unplanned one. At the start, 3.2 million acre-feet sounded like the story. At the end, it sounds like a question. If a river system needs 1 trillion gallons of restraint just to buy time, what does survival mean after that time is bought? The Colorado River will keep moving through canyons, dams, canals, fields, cities, and courtrooms. It will keep carrying snowmelt, heat, law, memory, and argument. It will keep revealing the gap between what was promised and what can be delivered. This crisis may pass from the front page, but the river has already delivered its warning. The next century of water in the American West will not be decided by who can claim the most from the old river. It will be decided by who can live honestly with the smaller one.